This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. I recently had the opportunity to join the annual 2023 Austrian Economics Discord Conference, which of course is held on the Discord platform. And my topic was the economic and financial landscape for 2023, which in my view is really in crisis, a crisis which began, we might say, during the COVID months of March and April of 2020 with the resulting fiscal and monetary response by our friends in the federal government and the central bank. So I basically take a look at the landscape and compare and contrast it with the Great Recession period of 2007, 2008, which I argue is very, very different. And in terms of our Austrian business cycle analysis, the two periods ought to be viewed very, very differently. So this is about a 35 or 40-minute presentation with some Q&A from the audience. And I think it lays out pretty neatly the Austrian perspective on what's happening right now with the Fed, with inflation, and with the possibility of a recession in 2023. So I hope you enjoy it. And we will be back next week with an episode on ESG and DEI with my great friend, Dr. Alan Mendenhall. So enjoy the show.
Our speaker here that's going to be kicking us off is the great Jeff Deist. He is the president of the Mises Institute. He's the author of Anatomy of the Crash, the Financial Crisis of 2020. He's a former chief of staff to the great Ron Paul whenever he was in Congress, and of course, host of the Human Action Podcast. With that being said, take us away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Rich, for hosting. So welcome anyway to 2023, which is the year where every normie on earth, every CNBC financial economist, commenter, and of course, all of our favorite court economists all of a sudden are experts in inflation and worried about inflation. So this is a new environment for most of us. Obviously, Austrians have been crying wolf in the wilderness for a long, long time, and were derided for crying wolf back in 2008, 2009 about inflation, of course. And with some fairness, I would say. So we find ourselves in this new environment where it feels like central bankers are up against something they really, at least in the West, have not experienced in over 40 years, which is actual consumer price inflation rising rapidly, or at least maintaining rapidly. But at the same time, huge levels of sovereign debt, which make it difficult to just raise interest rates as high as you might want to, allegedly to kill inflation, because of the cost of that debt service to Congress. And I'm sure when you look at that $31 trillion of debt that the U.S. federal government carries, only about 26 of it, if you consider interagency debt. Well, the average interest rate on that for the last 20, 30 years has been very low. Its weighted average has been below 2%. So you get that up closer to historical norms of 5, 6, 7%, and all of a sudden, very quickly, interest becomes the single biggest line item in the congressional budget, ahead of defense, ahead of Social Security, Medicare, all these things people want from government. So, it's a difficult and new environment for central bankers. Again, in the West, especially the U.S. Fed, they've been able to pretty much do what they want without having to worry about these things for almost 40 years. There haven't been real interest rates. And so anybody who's under about age 40 has never really lived in an environment where we truly understood or recognized the time value of money. So that's unusual. And when we think about economics, when we dial back to a 50,000 foot view and we say, well, gee whiz, in this new environment in 2023, after COVID, what can the Austrian school do to position itself to be relevant, to be vital in the national debate? Because if you look at the last crisis of 2008, probably the Austrian school took a bit of a black eye. Well, I think first of all, we have to understand that, mainstream economics and economists more generally, whether academic or professional places at the Fed, I think they've really lost the plot. In other words, the economics is a social science. It is supposed to help us understand the human world and make better sense of it. It's not there to help us understand atoms or molecules or statistical models. And so, is economics doing its job? Is the profession doing any good? I mean, that's a pretty serious question. From where I sit, I would argue that the profession is doing a fair amount of harm in that it's providing intellectual cover for a bunch of bad, what I guess I'll call public policy ideas. And so economics doesn't exist to provide sinecures. It doesn't exist to provide academic tenure. It doesn't exist so a bunch of people can work at the Fed or even at Amazon, right? It exists to help us understand the world, the human world, and as a result, become happier, healthier, wiser, wealthier. And so let's not forget that that's the goal. And so the Austrian school ought to take its place amongst the voices trying to further that goal, because I'm not so sure that that's what mainstream economics is really about these days. So before we can maybe consider what Austrians have to offer the public in 2023, I think we have to understand a little bit about where we are. So let's start with that terrible period of 07 and 08, the last Great Recession. And notice we're having these economic upheavals every 10 or 15 years. We're on our second one, and we're only a quarter of a way into the new century. So it strikes me that one of the goals of the Federal Reserve Act was to smooth out these booms and busts. Not sure that that's working out as well as advertised. But nonetheless, if we go back to 2007, 2008, I think that was a very different situation than the one we face today. I think we can look back on that with some benefit of hindsight, not just pure theory or deduction, but with hindsight as well. And we can say, but that was largely a monetary phenomenon. And if you read David Stockman's book, The Great Deformation, there are, in my opinion, some pretty strong arguments that the contagion would have been restricted to the financial sector if Congress and the Fed had not taken all the dramatic actions they did take on both the fiscal and monetary side to stimulate. And that, in fact, Main Street could have been okay. We could have had maybe a rough year or two, and that all of that extraordinary monetary policy was not necessary. But nonetheless, it took place. And so when we look back on that, we have to understand that, again, most of the action was on the monetary policy side. There was some fiscal stimulus among the outgoing Bush administration, but this was mostly new extraordinary Fed policy where the Fed's balance sheet went from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion. Interest rates were shoved even further down than they had been. And a couple other unusual things happened during that period, which I think bear remark. One is that bank reserves were the monetary choice, right? In other words, the Fed created money and bought assets from commercial banks, mostly treasury debt, and also a lot of packaged mortgage debt. Okay, so all of that money, all of that newly created base money simply became bank reserves amongst on deposit with the Fed amongst member banks and commercial banks. So what we didn't completely understand, and we understand better now, given hindsight, of course, is that bank reserves don't guarantee lending. As a matter of fact, of course, bank reserves by definition are not lent to the general public or to commercial borrowers. They're just lent between banks. So you basically had the Fed recapitalizing a bunch of insolvent banks like B of A. They were forced to buy Countrywide. If they had had to mark to market the value of those Countrywide mortgages, that company would have been enormously underwater. But that didn't happen. They weren't required to do that. And so basically all that QE, which took place in earnest between, especially 08 and 12 to 14 and there was a form of recapitalizing the banks. And so banks found themselves they weren't reserve restrained, they were capital restrained. They still needed to go out and find creditworthy borrowers and good projects. And in the teeth of a pretty nasty economy, they were actually pretty happy to leave those reserves parked with the Fed. And there wasn't even much overnight lending or interbank lending because, again, they were all flush with reserves. They didn't have to borrow from each other. So those reserves did it really in no way, shape, or form made their way out into the broader economy in the way some Austrians thought they would, and thus create price inflation, consumer price inflation. The other thing that goes oftentimes unnoticed, but some economists have written about, is that for the first time, the Fed started paying interest on excess reserves held by member banks. So this was actually something that a lot of people think the Fed just ginned up on its own as a policy. This was actually a law passed by Congress back in 2006. And it was designed to go into effect in 2011. This was actually a long-time monetary policy tool the Fed had sought. Even Milton Friedman advocated this. They wanted to be able to control the Fed funds rate better or the targeted Fed funds rate better by paying interest on reserves. So what happened is this law passed in 2006 was accelerated to go into effect in October of 2008. So all of this extraordinary monetary policy of the time ended up creating a bunch of bank reserves, effectively recapitalizing the banks and making them solvent in the nominal sense anyway, and also paying them interest on those reserves, which again further further decreased any appetite to be moving those reserves around interbank. So that the takeaway here is that all that QE, all that Fed balance sheet growth did not directly flow into the economy in the way that fiscal stimulus does. And so again, the banks were not reserve constrained; they were capital constrained. So banks have capital requirements; they have to have credit-worthy borrowers. They have to make money above their costs to stay in business. So we didn't, that's all very clear and easy to say now, looking back on the situation. But nonetheless, I think we all understand, and I think even the general public senses, that taking the Fed's balance sheet and quadrupling it, and of course, we'll get to how much higher that balance sheet has gone since the 2008 crash, that was going to come with a cost somehow. The question is how and when over time does that cost occur, and how do we pay for it? So I'm going to recommend to our listeners a great article. Some of you are probably familiar with Lynn Alden. She's an investment advisor. She published an article called "The Ultimate Guide to Inflation" back in 2021, and for a long time it was paywalled. But anyway, when I just Google Lynn Alden Guide to Inflation, at current it's not paywalled. You'll come up with her website, and so this is a great, quick and dirty little explainer for people who just want to be able to read it themselves or maybe circulate to their friends. And the beginning of the article is the three types of inflation. So we have monetary inflation, we have consumer price inflation, we have asset price inflation. So understanding those three types, I think, helps us understand better what happened in 07, 08 and in the aftermath. So I really recommend that. She's a good, clear writer on the subject, and not an Austrian per se, but it's always good to get outside voices. But she's clearly sympathetic to our view of inflation. So I recommend that article to understand what happened in 08 versus what's happening today. So if we fast forward to not 2020, when most people think the crisis started, right? Most people think March of 2020, COVID came along and both the Fed and Congress went nuts. Well, that's true, but lost in all this COVID, takeover of all of our attention and all the grabbing all the media headlines was this crazy little September of 2019 repo crisis. Now, this was an event that caused a lot of shock and awe amongst the financial journalists because just a year or two before, the Fed had finally started its vaunted, famous tapering project, where it was going to take that balance sheet, which had gotten up way over $4 trillion at one point, and they were going to start to let these treasuries that they own mature and roll off rather than purchasing a new or recapitalizing those treasuries. So as a result, the Fed's balance sheet actually went down a little bit, not much as a percentage, but it went down a little bit for a period of about a year. And everyone said, well, this is the famous tapering that we promised you. that, we're going to reduce the Fed's balance sheet. Eventually, this extraordinary monetary policy will come to an end. And this was promised all the way back by Fed officials back in 2010. I mean, James Bullard, who was president of the St. Louis Fed, he said, the FOMC, we intend to return the Fed's balance sheet to its normal pre-crisis levels over time. Once that occurs, the Treasury will be left with just as much debt held by the public as before the Fed took any of those actions. Well, that's a strong statement, because that would require taking the balance sheet from over $4 trillion down to below $1 trillion. And of course, we all know they were never going to do that. But he could say that in 2010 with a straight face. So you fast forward to about 2018, and it actually kind of started trying to do that a little bit. And there's a statement from the St. Louis Fed in 2013 by a pair of Fed economists, David Endelfato. Many of you know that name. He was on a Bob Murphy podcast. Not an Austrian, but a friendly guy, and Lee. And so they basically came out with this, this paper saying, hey, look, everyone's telling us the Fed is just monetizing debt, and we're financing the federal government through this monetization. No, that's not true. That because this Treasury debt isn't going to be permanent. That would mean that the supply of new money would also be permanent. That would mean the federal government can essentially borrow and spend this new money for free. So, they said very honestly, thus, under this scenario, money creation becomes a permanent source of financing for government spending. So they admitted that. Well, it's not admission. I mean, monetary policy people just sort of don't think like us. To me, that's a gotcha or an aha moment. But to them, it was just, business as usual. But then this press release also says, on the other hand, if the Fed's increase in Treasury debt holdings is temporary, and the public will expect the monetary base to go to a more normal level, the Fed's selling the securities or letting them mature without replacing this. Under this scenario, the Fed's not monetizing government debt, and some other means other than money creation will be needed to finance the Treasury debt return to the public through open market sales. Well, that's interesting. We used to, I don't know, when I was a kid, I used to think we financed the government with taxes. I guess I'm showing my age here. But at any rate, my point is that the Fed told us that, all this $4 trillion of new Treasury debt and mortgage debt we added is temporary. Okay. So with all of that new monetary base created, how in the hell in the fall of 2019, was there a liquidity crisis in overnight repo lending between banks? I mean, after all those trillions of new bank reserves, how is it possible that we could get to September 2019 and find banks in an overnight crunch to the extent that the New York Fed had to provide $75 billion of overnight liquidity in the fall of 2019? Well, I don't really know the answer. I never really got an answer to that. I've been searching around. But what happened, and some people would call this conspiracy. I don't think it is. But I mean, some people say it's awfully convenient that right when the Fed was starting to have to once again increase its balance sheet and provide liquidity and stop even that modest tapering it had begun, all of a sudden, there's this virus in March of 2020. And of course, because of the severity of the crisis, I would argue there was a dramatic overreaction by governments worldwide to this virus. That's a separate debate. But nonetheless, nobody questioned in the face of this virus and the lockdowns, the economic lockdowns, that extraordinary Fed action was necessary. And if the virus hadn't come along, I think a lot of people would be saying, hey, what the hell? You guys just spent 10 years with this more than that, with this extraordinary monetary policy, and all of a sudden we're having a repo crisis. I mean, it seems like we're seizing up again. But all those questions went out the window with COVID. It was all hands on deck, and everybody understood, look, we got to do whatever it takes. Well, whatever it takes was this time around almost entirely, not entirely, but mostly a fiscal response, a fiscal phenomenon. So that's what's so different between the 2020 crisis and the 2008 crisis. This was a fiscal response. And so we have to understand that under both the Trump and Biden administrations, Congress passed two huge stimulus bills in 2020 and 2021. Now, these pumped more than $5 trillion with a T, capital T, directly into the economy. Okay, this was cash, as I'd like to say, right? And when I say directly in the economy, I mean payments to state and local governments, payments to households. Remember all the stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment benefits, employer payroll loans. Remember those PPP loans if you stayed open? Most of those did not have to be paid back if you met certain requirements, like you didn't go out and buy a Ferrari with them, as some business owners did, actually. Huge cash subsidies to the airlines. I'm not sure many Americans understand the airlines came out of the travel shutdowns of 2020 with more cash on their balance sheets than they went in, after having mothballed all those planes in the desert with nobody flying. That's a neat trick. If you can shut down your business and come out on the other end with more cash on your balance sheet. We'd all like to be in such an industry, right? And also countless payments to all kinds of other industries. And plus a whole grab bag of earmarks, things like sprucing up the Kennedy Center, Performing Arts Center in DC. I mean, this was just $5 trillion of cash that went onto people's bank accounts. And boy, oh boy, they spent it. Or they are spending it today. So that obviously is going to have a much more direct effect than on consumer prices, on supply and demand, than QE and the monetary approach had back in 2008. Now, on top of all this, even today, supply chains are still screwed up and constrained from the COVID period. Okay, even today, things are not back to normal. Look at the auto industry. They're still expecting chip shortages and basically shortages in the amount of new cars available in the United States throughout 2023, which of course is going to put pressure on used car prices because there's fewer new cars to buy. So these things still have not worked themselves out. Okay. So at the same time as you're pumping $5 trillion in direct cash stimulus into the economy, you are sending people home to make fewer goods and services under the lockdowns. You're screwing up supply chains all over the world. And remember, this is a just-in-time society we live in terms of inventory. Everything is about lean. Everything's about not having a ton of inventory. Everything is about streamlining, using economies of scale around the globe, and having huge container ships take everything around. And of course, that's a miracle. We're all for global trade and specialization, comparative advantage. I mean, that's one thing that makes us all so wealthy today. But, when you shut it down, you got some problems because companies don't have inventory laying around the way they would have had 30 years ago, let's say. So you've got huge fiscal stimulus at the same time as you have enormous constraints on supply. I mean, people just aren't going to work. They aren't traveling as much. They aren't going out to dinner as much. They aren't buying as much gasoline. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. You don't have to study monetary policy. This was a fiscal phenomenon. So I think as a result of that, we have to view the situation we're in 2023, still coming out of the COVID malaise. I think we have to view it differently to what David Stockman calls the BlackBerry panic of 2008. BlackBerries, for those of you who don't know, were the things everyone carried around before smartphones. Meaning what he meant was that crash would have largely affected the financial class, the banking class, the lending class, the stock and bond holders, not so much mom and pop. Whereas this is a very different kind of crisis. So if we understand it correctly, and we say, what can Austrian economics do? What can people who think like us do to tell a good story in 2023, to help to build a narrative, to help people understand the situation? Because again, I don't think mainstream economists are going to provide any help. I think they're going to just pivot and start sounding like Austrians on inflation. And of course, they're going to prescribe the same terrible kicking the can down the road that they prescribed the last time around. So these are not the people who are going to save America from its own political high time preference tendencies, right? If we listen to them, we're cooked. So, we have to be trying to get out there with the real message. And I think we have to be talking to normies. We have to be talking to just intelligent lay people. I think we have to have the mindset of doing an end run basically around academia and the talking head economists, the Paul Krugmans of the world, because they still have the bad incentives to keep parroting this idea that you can tinker with knobs and you can use fiscal and monetary policy to somehow create greater wealth in society through financial engineering, when we all know the only way to create greater wealth in society is to have profits which produce capital accumulation, which produce capital investment, which produce greater productivity. There's no shortcut, and a digital world doesn't change that. So I'm going to make you a couple suggestions, and I'll try to quit here at the bottom of the hour as to how we can be relevant in this 2023 discussion. I think first, it's very important that we avoid discussions of hyperinflation and this de-dollarization rhetoric, which is growing. I mean, we've been talking about the dollar's fall for a long time, and the idea that the world is going to get sick of having to do international business and clear transactions in dollars, buy oil in dollars, conduct international trade, especially for commodities in dollars. And that at some point, the world's going to resent this. They're going to rise up against us, and China is going to join with India. They're going to join with the Russians. And of course, that's true, I think, in the long run. I do think that the rest of the world has a very, very dollar off its world reserve currency pedestal, and that we as Americans are really quite clueless about the enormous subsidy that status provides us and how we're able to export inflation, how rich we are, how cheap everything is at Walmart and Target as a result. I think most Americans really don't have any sense of that, and I hope that they don't have to get a sense of that in a very harsh way sometime in the future. But in the shorter term, you have to understand, if you look at the dollar exchange, the DXY, I mean, this is just the dollar versus a basket of other currencies. There's nothing about these other currencies and the governments underlying them that give us any indication whatsoever that they are on a better path than us. The euro, the yuan, forget it. I mean, currencies are relative, and I think that the dollar is going to do quite well against other currencies for the foreseeable future. If anything, if there's a real shutdown or slowdown in 2023, that probably creates a flight to U.S. treasuries, a flight to U.S. dollars as a perceived safe haven relative to these other currencies, which are just crappier and even as inflated, if not more. So I don't think that the dollar is dying. I don't think that's a good narrative for us. And I would suggest people go check out the dollar milkshake theory. Brent Johnson at Santiago Capital is credited with coming up with that. And I think his pinned tweet is a brief YouTube, which explains it. And I'm not saying that I'm 100% in agreement with the dollar milkshake theory, but I think it's important as Austrians that we're looking at other perspectives and considering them. And I think he makes a lot of good points about why the dollar might well be strong relative to other currencies for some time coming. And let's not forget our military as well. And so the point here is that what we ought to care about, and what Americans ought to care about, is the dollar's strength against actual goods and services. That's what we care about, not its strength necessarily against other currencies. I think it's also a very good time to go back and talk to normies about money conceptually. Right? I mean, there's been a conversation about money in recent years, but I think it's been a distorted one. And as much as I love our Bitcoin friends and have learned a lot from them, and Bitcoin people have sent a lot of people to Austrian economics and vice versa. What I don't like is some of these almost new agey discussions around money. Money is an information system. Okay. Money is a way to help us avoid barter, and it's the most saleable commodity. And we don't have to argue the digital versus physical thing. I mean, we just have to understand that this is an opportunity to disabuse people of their mythologies about money. Because if you just read the CNN and you just watch normie news or something, I mean, what you'd come away with is that money is a political tool, right? It's a creation of government. It's a political tool. It's a weapon. And that interest rates are policy tools. They're like knobs. They're like dials that you turn on an old tube amp or something. This idea of money as a political tool is very, very harmful. And I think we have an opportunity, if people are starting to get upset about inflation, to disabuse them of that. And I think at the same time, to really attack this expertocracy, this technocracy idea that there are these really smart central bankers and they all went to Wharton and Stanford and Sorbonne or whatever. And we need to listen to them because, this stuff's just too complicated for us. And, just like are you a doctor talking about ivermectin? Well, are you a Fed economist? You shouldn't be talking about interest rates. I think that this is a great time to puncture that and to show that there's really nobody flying the plane, that these guys are making it up, that this is all ad hoc, that some of the things like, for instance, Jerome Powell is saying are directly contradictory to what he was saying a year or so ago. And it harkens back to when Benjamin Bernanke was saying, the housing market looks pretty good. And he's saying this in 2006 or whatever. So it's really up to us to de-bamboozle the public and demystify this stuff. It's not so difficult for an intelligent person to understand with a little bit of basic reading. And also, they ought to understand it because it's in their interest to understand what governments and central banks are doing to us more than for us. And, we should be out there making the case that, hey, there's a populist case to be made here, that these guys are not exactly what you think they are, that they don't really understand as well as they think. And they really are just kind of flying blind. And they spent, the last 10 years caterwauling about how there's no inflation. And we need more inflation. We need 2%. Inflation's 0. We need 2%. And now all of a sudden they're like, well, we just need 2% average over time. And it's been so low for the last few years. It's good to have 6 or 8 for a while because that'll bring the average up. And if you look at a sine wave, against an XY axis, it'll average out to 2%. I mean, this is just complete Monday morning quarterbacking. This is just CYA, come on. So I think, look, we have to appeal to the people we can appeal to. There's a significant percentage of the population who's never, ever, ever going to be interested in economic theory. It's just the way it is. And God bless them. There's nothing wrong with that. They're living their lives. They're paying their mortgages. You're talking about a Toyota Camry, they care about the car. They don't care about the automotive engineering. And most people don't care about the why of a prosperous economy. Some people care about the how, and we can generally call them entrepreneurs. And then some people care about the what. All people care about the what, right? So it's academics and wonks who care about the why. It's entrepreneurs who care about the how, but it's the general public who cares about the what. What's going on? Is the economy good or bad? How much is gas? Did I get a raise? Am I able to go on vacation this year? What's my interest rate on that car I bought? That's the what. So I think if we think about it in those terms, the why, the how, and the what, you can kind of separate people into those 3 categories. But again, there's a whole segment of the U.S. population, or anywhere you go, who simply don't believe in the concept of economic laws, right? They would never view it like gravity. If the wing's not curved and the air on top of the wing's not moving faster than it is under the wing and thus creating lift, the airplane crashes into the ground. Everyone would nod their heads. If the bridge is not constructed using the right mathematical calculations to bear a certain load, when the truck drives over it, maybe the 100th time, the bridge collapses. I think people can nod their head and understand that. But when you talk about economic laws, a lot of people think that's just all nonsense. They think that economies can be just commanded by legislative fiat. You just raise the minimum wage, and that economics is just complete BS. It's just a bunch of pseudo-intellectual cover for moneyed interests and capitalists. A lot of people believe that, or you've probably heard, economics is just astrology for white guys, which is pretty damn funny. We say the left can't meme, but that's pretty good. You got to admit. And so that's what we're up against. But there's just a different way to look at this. And I think the Austrian school can offer a better understanding of where we are and how we can rebuild. The productivity, Say's law, production precedes consumption. That's the way to approach this, to say, hey, there's the way forward is not through some esoteric new knowledge or through some, new monetary system, central bank digital currencies, or some new currency under the auspices of the IMF or the World Bank. We have the knowledge. Everything old is new again. And I think we just have to have the courage to go out there and challenge the so-called mainstream, the so-called orthodoxy, and just talk to normies and say, look, how's that Fed working out for you, my friend? Are you getting an 8, 9, 10% raise every year at work, or is your business growing 8, 9, 10% a year? The answer is probably no. And that's our opening. So that's my piece for today, to just try to give an overview of where we are and how Austrians might have something to say about it. So, I appreciate Rich doing this, and I thank all of you for listening.
Absolutely. So we have a few questions here for you. First one here is, what is your outlook for 2023 in terms of inflation?
I think they'll be able to say it's down nominally. I think they will do whatever they have to do to turn bad news into good news. Just these rate hikes. I mean, this is sort of like, shooting yourself in the foot because you've got a hung toenail. I mean, this idea that rising prices means we ought to raise interest rates to reduce all the froth in the economy and bring down wages and increase the cost of capital. Well, we need more production. The natural response to rising prices would be more production, not less. And so this is almost like bloodletting. We're trying to get less production. We're trying to quell wages. And let's not forget, it's not proven that raising interest rates per se reduces inflation, because if anything, it increases the cost of capital for firms trying to create goods and services, but also those marginal firms that are more leveraged than others, those ones that are shakier in their industries, a lot of them might go out of business if they don't operate as much on free cash flow and operate more on debts. They're a zombie company or whatever. So raising interest rates and quelling supply, trying to push down wages I hope someday we look back on that and say that's pretty crazy. But I do think that these interest rate increases, they will pivot on that in 2023. They won't keep raising, but I think the raising they've done to date will probably bring down nominal inflation somewhat.
All right, next question. What are your thoughts about the impending threat of central bank digital currencies? Any advice on how to avoid/resist this draconian possibility?
Well, it's one of the biggest threats facing us, along with what I would say is, along with maybe second is the amount of derivatives out there. The shadow banking contagion is pretty terrifying if you think about how much bigger all the debt has gotten since '08. But if you Google, there's a great short segment, Neil Kashkari, I think he's at Chicago Fed, excuse me if I'm wrong, and he gives about 2 or 3 minutes on how terrible central bank digital currencies are. The only reason you would have them is to spy on people, to tax their transactions, to impose a negative interest rate on them, on their accounts. And there are members of Congress who flat out say, why don't we just get rid of commercial banks and everyone's bank account is with the Fed? And then we can just credit your account with some money to stimulate, or we can, I suppose if you're a January 6th insurrectionist, we can put your account on hold, whatever it might be. I mean, this is genuinely being talked about. And there's a trial balloon with some of the commercial banks like Citi and B of A in New York on the technical attempt to work it out. So I think what you'd see at first would be a straddle, a hybrid, where there are ostensibly private banks, B of A and such, involved. It wouldn't just be a Fed account, but then it could lead to that. So it's really quite terrifying. And I think what it's going to take for them to try to engineer that would be another real crisis. So if this recession, which appears to be unfolding in 2023, if it turns really, really serious into some sort of global deep recession like we saw in 2008, they might seize on that to say, well, look, folks, we can't have all these countries just issuing their own currencies and their own bond debt willy-nilly and competing with each other. It causes too many dislocations. So now we need to centralize all this. That's going to hold an awful lot of appeal to politicians. I mean, that is, talk about the serpent in the Garden of Adam and Eve, that's really scary stuff. And we ought to be out there. I mean, we ought to be out there at the forefront of attacking that.
Speaking of recession, next question here is, should we expect more tech layoffs in 2023?
I don't know. I'm not really close to the tech industry. I have a brother in it, but, look, there's probably, the tech industry has generally higher salaries. It's been a real bright spot for the United States. If we go all the way back to the late 90s, when all those, when everyone was just getting online and email was new and all that stuff. I mean, America was a real leader. And we talk about we've lost all our manufacturing jobs and we don't make steel and all that. Yeah, but we were a king hell leader in software. And Silicon Valley was a real bright spot. And even today, there are an awful lot of people who without being entrepreneurial, just having some brains and being good at their jobs and, make $200,000-$400,000 a year. So I think, probably as a percentage, you would expect an industry like that to lay off more people than, a more garden variety industry that's full of $40,000 a year people. I mean, I think that just makes sense. But, it's hard to say. I mean, how much TikTok and how much coding do we need? I don't know. I guess that's above my pay grade.
Next question here is, with bonds getting crushed this year, could we expect greater fiscal constraints on state governments moving forward as deficits become harder to finance?
God, I hope so. Look at California. I mean, California raises an enormous percentage of its tax revenue from a tiny percentage of individuals. Tiny. It's even more skewed than federal. And a lot of that revenue is not just regular income tax, it's capital gains. And so if those capital gains returns drop, and more importantly, increasing those, just literally less than a million people, a few 100,000 people who really fund California, if they increasingly flee, as they are, they're going to Incline Village, Nevada, they're going to Florida, they're going to Palm Beach, they're going to Austin, they're going wherever they're going. The drying up of tax revenue is going to just challenge the hell out of these governors, because I mean, who wants to lend California money on a let's say a bond for high speed rail or some total bullshit? At anything other than the junk bond rates, not me. So, look, we have this bizarre idea in the U.S. that when there's an economic slowdown or recession, the government should spend more, and that the private sector should tighten its belt. Now, that's led to some very perverse outcomes. I mean, some of these pension fund liabilities, for example. Boy, oh boy, I hope that's true. But you got to think, at the end of the day, when it comes to interest rates, the Fed is always going to ultimately come down on the side of bond and equity markets over average people. I mean, I think it has to do that just because of the solvency of its own member banks, their stock price at the end of the day. So if I have to guess, I will say that the Fed will pivot on rates this year and that they won't go up that much more. And so, as long as you're in a state that's not dying, as long as you're in a state like Florida or something like that, right now, the state budgets coming out of COVID are actually pretty healthy. I live in the state of Alabama, and it has record surpluses. So again, sometimes our, not ideology, but our worldview, we want to be these grumpy Austrians. And you always got to look at the facts on the ground. I thought COVID would cause huge decreases in state tax revenue, and it didn't. I mean, it just, as a matter of fact, it didn't. I was wrong. And sometimes you just got to look at that. So I don't know. I can't imagine as Uncle Sam gets increasingly dysfunctional, maybe state and local governments are actually going to increase what they do.
We'll do one last question here, and we'll take a break from the economics and finance. Last question here is, do you think that the latest All Quiet on the Western Front movie did just the book?
Oh boy, I've read that book a million times as a kid. I've seen the movie, different versions of the movie. I haven't seen the new one on Netflix because I don't have Netflix. I've gotten a private password or two from some people, but I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I hope they didn't wokeify it.
I have seen the movie, and I can tell you that it is not wokeified. It's a very good movie. I recommend you watch it, especially if you're a fan of the books. But that being said, thank you very much, Mr. Dice, for being here with us today. We appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.